Have you ever wondered why countries owe trillions of dollars? Like, where does all that money even come from? And more importantly, who are they borrowing it from? Here's something wild. The United States alone owes over $33 trillion. That's trillion, with a T. To put that in perspective, if you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you over 90,000 years to spend that much money. But here's what nobody tells you. This isn't just an American thing. Countries all over the world are drowning in debt. Japan owes about $10 trillion. China owes nearly $15 trillion. The European Union combined? We're talking tens of trillions more. And the craziest part? This number just keeps growing. Every single day. Every single hour. Right now, as you're watching this, the world's debt is ticking up by millions of dollars. So, what's really going on here? Why does the entire world owe so much money? And should we actually be worried about it? Here at Simple Money, we've spent countless hours breaking down complex financial concepts to make them simple. And today, I'm going to reveal the truth behind global debt, the real reasons it exists, who actually benefits from it, and what it means for your future. Because here's the thing. Understanding how countries get into debt isn't just about massive numbers and economic theory. It's about understanding the very foundation of how our modern economy works. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me start with something that might shock you. When we talk about debt, we automatically think it's bad. Like, obviously, right? Owing money is stressful. It's limiting. It keeps you up at night. But here's what's really happening. Countries don't think about debt the same way you and I do. When you or I borrow money, we're usually trying to buy something we can't afford right now. A car, a house. Maybe we're covering an emergency expense. Countries work differently. They borrow money as a deliberate strategy. It's not about living beyond their means. It's about investing in their future. Think about it this way. Imagine you have a small business. You're making decent money, but you see an opportunity. If you buy new equipment, you could double your revenue. But that equipment costs $100,000, and you don't have that kind of cash sitting around. What do? You take out a loan? You go into debt? But here's the key. If that equipment really does help you double your revenue, then the debt was worth it. You'll pay back the loan and still come out ahead. That's exactly how countries think about debt. They borrow money to build infrastructure. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals. All the things that make an economy run smoothly and grow stronger. But wait, there's something else going on here that makes this even more interesting. When you or I borrow money, we have to eventually pay it back. All of it, with interest. If we don't, we lose our house. Our car gets repossessed. Our credit score tanks. Countries? They operate under completely different rules. A country doesn't actually have to pay back its debt. Not really. Not all at once, anyway. See, countries can just keep refinancing. When a debt payment comes due, they can borrow more money to pay off the old debt. It's like having a credit card that you never fully pay off. You just keep making minimum payments and occasionally getting new credit cards to pay off the old ones. And here's where things get wild. As long as a country's economy keeps growing, this system actually works. Because debt is just a number. What really matters is the ratio between debt and economic output. Let me explain that. If you make $50,000 a year and you owe $50,000, that's concerning. But if you make $500,000 a year and you owe $50,000, that's nothing. You could pay that off easily. Countries work the same way. If a country's economy is growing faster than its debt, then the debt becomes less and less significant over time. It's like how your parents probably thought $5,000 was a massive amount of money when they were young, but now it doesn't seem like as big a deal because wages and prices have gone up. Now here's where most people get confused. They hear $33 trillion and think, how will we ever pay that back? That's an impossible amount of money. But economists aren't actually worried about paying it back. They're worried about something else entirely. The ratio. The percentage of debt compared to economic output. That's what matters. The United States has a debt to GDP ratio of about 120%. That means the country owes about 20% more than it produces in a year. That's high. It's definitely concerning. But it's not catastrophic. Want to know what catastrophic looks like? Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of over 260%. They owe more than 2.5 times their annual economic output. And yet, Japan's economy hasn't collapsed. They're still functioning. Still one of the most developed nations in the world. So what gives? Why can countries get away with this level of debt when it would destroy a normal person? This brings us to the first major reason why global debt reaches the trillions. And I call this the printing press privilege. Here's something wild that most people don't realize. Countries that control their own currency can never actually go broke. Not in the traditional sense anyway. Think about it. If you owe someone money and you can't pay them back, you're in serious trouble. But what if you could just print the money you need? Problem solved, right? That's essentially what countries with their own currency can do. The United States can print dollars, Japan can print yen, the United Kingdom can print pounds. If they need money, they can create it. Now before you think, wait, why doesn't everyone just do this all the time? Here's the catch. Printing money doesn't create real value. It just creates more pieces of paper, or more accurately, more digital numbers in bank accounts. If you print too much money without your economy actually growing, you get inflation. The money becomes worth less. Prices go up. Your currency loses value on the world stage. And if you really go crazy with it, you get hyperinflation. Think Germany in the 1920s or Venezuela in recent years, where you need a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy bread. But here's the key insight. As long as a country prints money responsibly, in pace with economic growth, they can sustain enormous levels of debt without collapsing. Because they can always service that debt, they can always make the interest payments. They can always refinance. This is why countries like the United States can owe trillions and trillions of dollars. Because everyone knows, at the end of the day, the US government can pay its debts. It might pay them back with slightly inflated dollars, but it will pay them back. This leads us to the second major reason. What I call the trust game. Debt only works if people trust you. Think about your own life. If you have good credit, banks will lend you money at low interest rates. They trust you'll pay them back. But if you have bad credit, either nobody will lend to you, or they'll charge you massive interest rates to compensate for the risk. Countries work the same way. The United States can borrow money at extremely low interest rates, sometimes less than 2 or 3%. Why? Because US Treasury bonds are considered one of the safest investments in the entire world. People and institutions from every country buy US debt because they trust it. They believe the United States will be around in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. They believe the US economy will keep growing. They believe they'll get their money back. This trust creates a cycle. The more people trust you, the cheaper it is to borrow money. The cheaper it is to borrow money, the more you can borrow without it hurting too much. And the more successfully you manage that debt, the more people trust you. It's a self-reinforcing system. And the United States, along with a handful of other stable developed nations, sits at the very top of this trust pyramid. But here's where things get interesting. Not all countries have this privilege. Countries with unstable governments, volatile economies, or a history of defaulting on debt, they have to pay much higher interest rates, sometimes 10, 15, even 20% or more. This creates a vicious cycle for poorer nations. They need money to develop their infrastructure and economy. But because they're seen as risky, borrowing costs them way more, which makes it harder to grow their economy, which makes them seem even more risky. Round and round it goes. So the rich countries can borrow huge amounts cheaply. The poor countries struggle to borrow even small amounts without getting crushed by interest payments. And this is one reason why global debt is concentrated in certain nations while simultaneously being spread everywhere. Now, let's talk about the third reason. This one's crucial. I call it the crisis response. Look at a graph of global debt over the past century. You'll notice something fascinating. Debt doesn't grow steadily, it spikes. And those spikes happen during crises. World War II? Massive spike in debt. Countries needed to fund their militaries, build weapons, support troops. They borrowed whatever they needed because losing the war wasn't an option. The 2008 financial crisis? Enormous spike in debt. Banks were failing. The economy was collapsing. Governments around the world borrowed trillions to bail out banks, stimulate economies, and prevent a full-scale depression. COVID-19 pandemic? The biggest spike we've ever seen. Almost overnight, governments needed to shut down entire economies, pay people to stay home, support businesses that couldn't operate, fund vaccine development and healthcare systems stretched to their limits. Each crisis adds trillions to global debt. And here's the thing. That debt doesn't go away when the crisis ends. It just becomes the new baseline. The new normal. Think about your own life. Maybe you went into debt to handle an emergency, medical bills, job loss, whatever it was. Even after the emergency passes, that debt is still there. You're still making payments. It affects your budget for years afterward. Countries work the same way. The debt from World War II, some of it is still on the books. The debt from 2008, still there. COVID debt? That'll be hanging around for decades. But here's what nobody wants to admit. These crisis responses often work. Yes, they add massive amounts to the debt. But they also prevent even worse outcomes. During the 2008 crisis, governments that borrowed heavily and spent aggressively recovered faster than countries that tried to cut spending and reduce debt. The austerity approach backfired for many nations. Their economies shrank, unemployment soared, and ironically, their debt-to-GDP ratios got worse anyway because the economy was shrinking. This taught governments a lesson. When crisis hits, you borrow and spend. You worry about the debt later when the economy is growing again and you can afford to deal with it. The fourth reason is what I call the low interest trap. For the past couple of decades, interest rates have been historically low. In some countries, they've even gone negative, which is absolutely wild when you think about it. Negative interest rates mean you're essentially paying someone to borrow your money. Why did this happen? After the 2008 crisis, central banks around the world dropped interest rates to near zero to encourage borrowing and spending. They wanted to stimulate economic growth, get money moving through the system. And here's what's fascinating. When interest rates are that low, debt becomes really cheap, like absurdly cheap. If you can borrow money at 1 or 2% interest and your economy is growing at 3 or 4%, you're actually making money by taking on debt. The value of what you build or invest in grows faster than the cost of borrowing. This created an environment where taking on debt was economically rational, not just for countries, but for corporations and individuals too. Everyone started borrowing. Because why wouldn't you? Money was practically free. But there's a problem with this. When everyone is borrowing, total debt keeps climbing, and climbing, and climbing. Even though each individual decision to borrow makes sense, the collective result is trillions upon trillions of dollars in debt across the entire global system. And now, here's the uncomfortable part. Interest rates are starting to rise again, which means all that cheap debt is starting to get more expensive. Countries that could easily afford their debt payments at 2% interest are suddenly struggling at 5 or 6%. This is creating tension in the system, because you can't just stop borrowing. Countries need to refinance existing debt. They need to fund ongoing operations. But now it costs more to do so, which means either they cut spending elsewhere or they just accept that a larger portion of their budget is going to debt service instead of education, healthcare, or infrastructure. The fifth major reason brings us to something economists call the demographic bomb. And this one's particularly tricky because it's about the future, not just the present. Most developed countries have aging populations. People are living longer, having fewer children, which sounds like a good thing, right? Living longer is great, but economically, it creates a massive challenge. Think about how government spending works. Governments collect taxes from working people. Then, they spend that money on public services, including support for retired and elderly people through programs like Social Security and Medicare in the United States. This system works fine when you have lots of working-age people and relatively fewer retired people. The workers pay in, the retirees receive benefits. Everyone's happy. But what happens when the ratio flips? When you have fewer workers supporting more retirees? The math stops working. Either you cut benefits, which is politically difficult and morally questionable, or you raise taxes significantly, which slows economic growth, or you borrow money to cover the gap. Guess which option most countries choose? They borrow. They push the problem into the future. Hope that maybe economic growth will solve it, or that birth rates will recover, or that some technological breakthrough will change the equation. This demographic issue is adding hundreds of billions to debt every year, and it's only going to get worse as the baby boomer generation fully retires and starts drawing maximum benefits. Countries like Japan, Germany, and Italy are already feeling this pressure. The United States will feel it more and more over the next couple of decades. It's debt that doesn't feel like debt in the moment. There's no crisis, no emergency. Just steady, predictable borrowing to cover the gap between what governments promised and what they can afford. But it adds up, year after year, compounding, growing, until you look up one day and realize trillions of dollars have been added to the national debt just to keep promises made to previous generations. Now let me blow your mind for a second. There's something even deeper going on here that almost nobody talks about. And it completely changes how we should think about global debt. Here's the thing. We keep talking about who countries owe money to, like there's some giant creditor in the sky waiting to collect. But when you really dig into it, the answer gets weird. Who does the United States owe $33 trillion to? About $7 trillion is owned by foreign countries and investors. China owns about $1 trillion. Japan owns about another $1 trillion. But the majority? Americans owe it to other Americans. The US government borrows money by selling treasury bonds. Who buys them? American pension funds, American investment companies, American banks, American individuals saving for retirement. The Social Security Trust Fund itself owns trillions in treasury bonds. So in a very real sense, America owes money to Americans. The government is borrowing from its own citizens, and those citizens count that government debt as part of their assets, their retirement savings, their financial security. This is true for most developed countries. They primarily owe money to their own citizens and institutions. Japan's massive debt? Mostly owed to Japanese people. Same pattern repeats across Europe and other wealthy nations. Now here's where this gets really interesting. If everyone owes money to everyone else, what happens if somebody actually tries to collect? If Japan decided to sell off all its US Treasury bonds, who would they sell them to? Other investors would buy them. And what would Japan do with all those dollars? Probably invest them in something else. Maybe bonds from other countries. Maybe stocks. Maybe real estate. The money doesn't disappear. It just moves around the system, round and round. Everyone owes money. Everyone is owed money. And as long as the music keeps playing, the system keeps working. Let me tell you about two countries. We'll call them Country A and Country B. They're going to show you why debt itself isn't actually the problem. Country A has a debt to GDP ratio of 40%. Relatively low. Responsible, right? But here's what Country A doesn't realize. Their economy isn't growing. Infrastructure is crumbling because they won't invest in it. Education system is falling behind. Healthcare is inadequate. They're so focused on keeping debt low that they're not investing in the things that make economies grow. Businesses can't operate efficiently without good roads and internet infrastructure. Workers aren't as productive without good education and healthcare. The economy stagnates. Young people leave to find opportunities elsewhere. And here's the kicker. Because the economy isn't growing, that 40% debt ratio starts looking worse and worse. Tax revenues fall, the debt stays the same, but the economy shrinks. 10 years later, Country A has a 60% debt ratio despite not borrowing much more. The math just worked against them. Now let's look at Country B. They have a debt to GDP ratio of 90%. Way higher. Scary looking number. But they're investing that borrowed money strategically. They build high-speed rail connecting major cities. They invest heavily in education, producing skilled workers. They upgrade their energy grid and internet infrastructure. They fund research and innovation. All of this costs money. Lots of money. But here's what happens. Businesses thrive because infrastructure is excellent. Workers are highly skilled and productive. New industries emerge. The economy grows rapidly. 20 years later, Country B still has significant debt. But their economy has grown so much that the debt ratio has actually fallen to 70%. And more importantly, their citizens have better jobs, higher incomes, and better quality of life. The difference wasn't about avoiding debt. It was about understanding that debt is a tool. Used wisely, it builds prosperity. Used poorly, or avoided entirely out of fear, it leads to stagnation. Here's what most people don't realize. The question isn't whether countries should have debt. The question is what they're doing with the money they borrow. It's not actually about the trillions of dollars at all. It's about whether those trillions are being invested in things that create value, or whether they're being wasted. You can have low debt and a failing economy. You can have high debt and a thriving society. The debt number by itself tells you almost nothing. What matters is what's behind that number. What's being built? What's being invested in? whether the borrowing is creating more value than it costs. Think about the most successful companies in the world. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, every single one of them has debt. Lots of it, billions of dollars. But nobody thinks they're in financial trouble, because they're using that debt to fuel growth, to invest in research, to expand, to innovate. Countries work the same way. Debt isn't a moral failing, it's a financial tool. And like any tool, it can be used well or poorly. The people who succeed in understanding economics don't just look at debt levels and panic. They look at what that debt is being used for. They look at whether investment is creating returns. They look at the long-term trajectory, not just the current snapshot. So the next time you hear that global debt has reached some new record number, don't just accept the scary headline. Ask yourself, what is that money being used for? Is it building infrastructure? Investing in education? Funding research and innovation? Or is it being wasted on things that don't create lasting value? The trillions of dollars in global debt aren't a sign that the world is broken. They're a sign that countries are making bets on their futures. Some of those bets will pay off spectacularly. Others will fail. But the game itself isn't going away. Because here's the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Our entire modern economic system is built on debt, credit, borrowing from the future to invest in the present. That's how growth happens. That's how progress is made. That's how we went from agrarian societies to the technological world we live in today. The world's debt reaches the trillions because that's the cost of progress, the cost of responding to crises, the cost of maintaining the trust and stability that keeps the global economy functioning. It's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. And once you understand that, you stop being scared of big numbers. You start asking the right questions instead. Not how much debt exists, but what it's creating. Not whether we can pay it back, but whether we're investing it wisely. That's the lens through which you need to view global debt. Not as a countdown to catastrophe, but as a measure of how much the world is investing in its own future. Sometimes wisely, sometimes foolishly, but always, constantly, betting that tomorrow will be better than today.